police say should still be alive, but her accused killer was out on bond. Police say the suspect was the victim's estranged spouse and that she was attacked in the past.
The night air was still, but something inside the house shifted. A door snapped. A child stirred. A single shot echoed into darkness. In that instant, a life changed forever. What you're about to hear is not just a story about a murder. It's the slow unwinding of a nightmare that too many warned was coming. Welcome to True Crime Watch HD. If you're new to this channel, hit subscribe now. This is the place where we dig deep, peel back layers, and shine a light on stories that demand to be remembered. She was a mother determined to protect her children. She had tried to escape. She had cried out for help, and she had seen the shadows closing in. But even then, nothing could prepare her or us for what would come. We begin this story with a voice, an anguished tear, a whispered plea. In the early hours of November 16, 2022, that voice would be silenced forever. Cornisha Butler was 29 years old. She was raising 4 children. She had dreams, responsibilities, routines. To most people, she seemed to lead an ordinary life. But lurking beneath that routine was tension, the kind that accumulates in small cracks, late messages, unexpected visits, verbal fights that left her unsettled. Something inside her told her danger was growing. Sometimes she'd glance at her phone and tense. Other times she'd hesitate before answering the door. Around her was a relationship that had frayed at the edges, something that had begun in hope but had twisted instead. She didn't confide every detail. Some nights she'd stay up late, staring into darkness, listening for sounds her children might not hear. She felt watched. She felt cornered. She felt trapped. Nobody saw it yet as a countdown, but to Cornisha, every incident became a red flag. One evening, months before that fatal night, her car burst into flames. She pulled from the driveway and watched the blaze devour her vehicle. She had to scramble to call for help. After the fire, she cried, frightened, shaken. She turned to the courts and got a restraining order. That should have been a break, a clear no more. But instead, the fire was only the beginning. She reported vandalism, intrusive messages, and a presence at her doorstep when she never invited it. She went to law enforcement many times. She filed complaints. She asked for protection. Yet each time her pleas were processed, then shelved. A bond was posted, a suspect released, a restraining order drawn but seldom enforced. The system, in its slow motion, became part of her struggle. Through it all, she tried to shield her children. She changed routines, installed alarms, slept with lights on. She confided in a close circle of friends, whispering fears she dared not voice loud. She described moments when she froze, when someone would stand just out of sight, or whisper something in passing that she couldn't quite hear. Then came the night when all the warnings converged. That night her heart must have been racing. Something didn't feel right weeks before. A message she saved. A conversation she later replayed in her mind. A promise made that broke. The children were asleep, the house quiet, but inside tension coiled, a heated exchange, words being hurled, but nothing to foreshadow what was about to erupt. The argument seemed contained. Then one person left. Then they returned, intent changed. And then the shot rang out. In that gunshot, the accumulated fear, the ignored signs, the institutional failures, all crackled into violence. A mother fell. A child watched. Silence swallowed the home. In those bewildering moments, investigators arrived to a scene drenched in questions. A single letter found at the site, written in perfect script, its words filled with longing, anger, and threat. That letter would become a key piece of the puzzle. Who had written it? To whom? Why now? People interviewed said they heard conversations before police arrived. Neighbors claimed they glimpsed someone leaving in haste. Cameras nearby captured fragments. No one saw the full motion. No one knows exactly how long she lay before help came. The forensic evidence would tell a story of its own: trajectories, residue, time of death. But the human story remained hazy, interwoven with intention, fear, regret. Fingers turned quickly toward someone close, someone with motive, history, and access. But motive alone isn't enough. The investigators had to build a case. They chased leads through phone records, text messages, travel logs, and social media posts. They dug into restraining order filings, prior police reports, and witnesses' memories. They looked for ties between the letter and person, for consistency in statements, for loopholes and inconsistencies. The more they uncovered, the darker the underworld of that relationship appeared. Reports of stalking, threats, and obsession emerged. Others who knew both parties began to speak, little details that looked innocuous at first. A missing key, a door unlocked, a camera in a room, a vehicle seen tailing someone at night. A pattern began to emerge. But the defense pushed back. They questioned interpretations. They challenged timelines. They pointed to gaps. They claimed alternative explanations. Every piece of evidence was contested. The tension shifted. Detective versus defense team, investigator versus loopholes. In that conflict lies much of the drama. In the courtroom, people heard that letter read aloud word for word. Each phrase laden with promise, rage, manipulation, a confession camouflaged in emotions. The letter bridged private agonies with public evidence. The prosecutors painted a picture. Someone consumed by control, someone unable to let go, someone letting love turn lethal. But the defense contested that portrait, arguing that nothing in that letter demanded murder, that the truth must rest on more than words. Witnesses took the stand. Some told of past threats, of sudden mood swings, of hidden behaviors. Others saw the accused in moments of calm, in contexts that suggested a more complicated human. The jury listened. The gallery watched. The back-and-forth deepened. Each side stripped layers, trying to reveal the real person behind the public face. When closing arguments began, prosecutors framed their narrative. A long-standing pattern of violence, the implicit threat made explicit, the letter, the escalation, the opportunity, the lack of alibi, the weapon retrieved. The defense swung back, alternate suspects, reasonable doubt, ambiguous wording, challenging the chain of custody of evidence, questioning whether threats were ever meant to be acted upon. But ultimately, a jury had to decide. Was this murder calculated or tragic? Was it passion gone too far or premeditated destruction? In the verdict, they would decide on first-degree murder or something lesser. They would rule on cruelty, firearm possession, and perhaps conspiracy. No matter the outcome, it would reopen public debate about the responsibilities of courts and law enforcement when someone cries for help multiple times. When the verdict finally came down, it wasn't just about one family's heartbreak. It was a statement. The judgment echoed into courtroom hallways, across newspaper headlines, into conversations about domestic violence, about how we define danger before it's too late. Night melted into early morning as investigators descended on the scene. Their first task was to preserve everything: the letter, the blood, the trajectory, the footprints, the silence. With each piece collected, the outline of what had happened would begin to emerge. But facts alone would not answer motive or intent, or whether what looked like obsession was truly premeditation. One of the investigators later told press that the letter found at the location was unlike a casual message. It was deeply emotional, loaded with longing and threat. It wasn't a note tossed aside, it seemed placed, perhaps meant to be found. That raised the first question: who wrote it? To whom? What was the context? The forensic team moved in. They collected gunshot residue, shell casings, fingerprints, DNA swabs, blood spatter, the gun itself. They tied trajectory lines. They sought to understand distances, angles, positions. The goal: reconstruct the final moments in painstaking detail. In every crime, the physical evidence has stories to tell, if interrogated carefully. Meanwhile, detectives combed through prior complaints, police records, and phone logs. Cornisha had filed multiple reports against her partner over months, alleging harassment, threats, stalking, and even property damage. In October 2021, her car was set on fire. She claimed her partner was behind it. That arson filed the earliest serious accusation. They found that after the car fire, Cornisha had obtained a restraining order. But restraining orders are only as strong as their enforcement. In many cases, courts issue them, then watch them fade into paperwork unless police act decisively. In this case, certain bond hearings allowed Shakia back into public life despite the accusations. Some law enforcement officials later voiced regret, saying if not for bail bonds, perhaps Cornisha might still be alive. Within phone records and social media, detectives discovered a post made the day before the killing. Shakia had published phrases like "time to start again" and "forget about the fast." Some believe these were coded threats, not emotional venting. The investigators traced digital footprints. Who accessed that post? When? From what device? Whether the post's metadata aligned with where Shakia claimed she was. Witnesses were interviewed. Friends of Cornisha described how she became more guarded, more fearful. She would hesitate when answering calls, lock doors behind her, change schedules. Some even said she confided in them that she feared for her life. Others close to Shakia recalled mood swings, jealousy, controlling behavior, and explosive arguments. Inconsistencies in alibis and statements began to stand out. One neighbor claimed to have seen someone leaving in a hurry after hearing gunshots. Another said they heard muffled cries before silence. Security cameras in the area captured a car speeding away minutes later. That car was traced. The license plate led investigators to a vehicle connected to Shakia. The timing matched. The vehicle was impounded and searches were conducted. The chain of custody became a battleground. Defense lawyers contested every piece of evidence. Was the gun properly stored? Were the fingerprints cross-contaminated? Was the letter handled in a forensically acceptable way? Did forensic technicians follow protocol? The prosecution anticipated these attacks and methodically obtained logs and lab reports so that when the defense challenged them, their counters would stand in court. Meanwhile, the story and news outlets began to frame the case in a broader narrative. Domestic violence, failure of protective systems, obsession turned lethal. Some local law enforcement leaders admitted remorse, saying that earlier decisions, especially releasing suspects on bond despite multiple domestic violence cases, would later haunt this case. As evidence piled up, people asked whether this was a crime of passion or cold calculation. The letter, although emotional in tone, contained phrases that prosecutors argued mapped to control, possessiveness, and demand. It hinted at resentment over the breakup, jealousy, inability to let go. By the time the case went to trial, the prosecution had lined up multiple charges. First-degree murder, possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony, cruelty to children. They knew they had to prove that this was not a sudden moment of anger, but a deliberate act, intent, planning, access, motive, opportunity, and no credible alternative explanation. From the defense side, arguments shrouded parts of the timeline in doubt. If you can insert enough ambiguity, a jury might find reasonable doubt. They questioned whether the letter was truly from Shakia, whether the digital trails were manipulated, whether forensic reports could be trusted, and whether someone else had an opportunity. They floated scenarios of misinterpretation and coincidence. On the stand, witnesses described volatile moments that had been dismissed as relationship drama. What to some seemed petty arguments in hindsight looked like warnings. Others testified Shakia had said things in private, thinly veiled threats. "I can't lose you. You'll regret this." That, in light of the murder, sounded chilling. Cross-examinations attempted to undermine memory, consistency, motive, and timeline. But here, where the tension rose, the letter. The prosecution had it read aloud in court, line by line. Every phrase, every mood, every punctuation became ammunition. The defense tried to argue selective interpretation, words without action. But to the jury, the letter was a map, connecting what had been private tension to public violence. Toward the end, closing arguments framed the story like a puzzle. Prosecution. This is a murder born of control, stalking, vindictiveness, and obsession. Every motion made sense in that narrative. Defense. Gaps remain, alternative explanations haven't been fully excluded, doubts linger. The jury had to decide whether what looked like obsession was murderous intent, whether the evidence told a single story or multiple. When the verdict finally emerged, it was a culmination, not just of a legal struggle, but of voices, pain, system failure, human fear. The investigators had their blueprint now. They already held the letter, shards of fired rounds, phone logs, statements. Their next mission: stitch those fragments into a coherent narrative that could stand under cross-examination. First, the forensics. Every shell casing, every fingerprint, every spatter pattern became a clue. Gunshot residue was matched to likely firing distance. The trajectory lines traced the path of bullets. Blood patterns showed where Cornisha fell and how she was struck. The jury would later hear how the medical examiner estimated time of death, entry wounds, possible defensive wounds. None of the science was glamorous, but each piece was a brick in the case. In parallel, detectives established a minute-by-minute timeline. They cataloged when Cornisha was last seen by neighbors, when security cameras time-stamped movement in the vicinity, when calls pinged cell towers. The suspects' fabricated alibis began to unravel under this digital pressure. One of the challenges was that some of the surveillance had gaps, moments when no camera was pointing, when logs didn't resolve, when memory dimmed. The defense would later seize on those gaps. Those gaps, however, could only delay truth, not prevent it. The evidence against the accused coalesced. The letter, which had been found at the scene, was not merely emotional but contained passages that prosecutors argued mirrored known grievances and prior threats. Passages referring to starting again, to "you can't leave me," to "I won't let go" became focal points. The prosecution argued this was no stray note of heartbreak. This was a document of someone who saw control slipping and sought to reclaim it permanently. At trial, the defense attacked tirelessly. They accused investigators of bias. They dissected lab reports. They argued inconsistencies in witness memory, not to show innocence necessarily, but to chip away at what the jury might accept as certainty. They claimed alternative suspects could exist, that evidence might be contaminated, that reasonable doubt persisted in vital segments of the case. In cross-examination, defense lawyers pressed witnesses. Are you absolutely sure this was her voice? Could that timestamp have been misrecorded? Was that social media post truly posted by her, or someone else on her account? They sought to recast the narrative into fragments rather than a single, murderous trajectory. They hoped to sow uncertainty. Yet the prosecution and investigators anticipated it. They carefully laid out the chain of custody for each piece of evidence, documented every handoff, preserved every original file, and kept redundant logs. They walked the jury through lab reports and how standards were followed. They brought in digital forensic experts and handwriting analysts to strengthen linkages. Then came the dramatic moment. The letter was read aloud in court. Every word, every shift in tone, every punctuation became part of the narrative. The prosecution used it like a map, mapping its emotional current onto the behavioral history of the accused. The defense countered, saying words are just words. Emotional sentiment does not equal intent to kill. But the impact on the jury was palpable. Those words felt raw. Those lines felt like confessions in code. Witnesses testified not only to objective facts but to internal feeling. A close friend of Cornisha described her fear in recent months, how she'd become more cautious, how she watched her messages, how she flinched at sudden doorbells. A former associate of Shakia painted her as volatile, possessive, insisting on control over private conversations and reacting explosively when resisted. Another witness described overheard threats, veiled jealousy, demands to reconnect. All of these testimonies, when assembled, began to form a portrait. One person desperate to contain what was slipping from her grasp. The defense tried to erode credibility. They questioned memory, motive, and bias. But the jury had to weigh more than one side's argument. They had to weigh a life's arc, a pattern of escalation, the physical evidence, and the emotional shadow cast by that letter. Was this a crime of sudden escalation or a calculated severing of life? Closing statements, the prosecution framed the narrative. Here is someone who lost control. She escalated from property damage, stalking, threats to violence. The letter was her blueprint. The act was her execution. All that remained was connecting bullet to intent, and the case is overwhelming. The defense urged caution. You must not convict on emotion. You must demand proof beyond reasonable doubt. There are uncertainties, alternative possibilities. You must not fill them with assumption. When the jury retired, tension gripped the courtroom. Family members, court staff, friends sat in hushed rows. The room became a vacuum. Every minute seemed to stretch. The verdict was coming, not just for the accused, but for the idea that repeated cries for help should always be answered. The verdict arrived. Guilty on first-degree murder, guilty of possession of a firearm during commission of a felony, guilty of cruelty to children. The court sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. That was, in effect, the legal judgment. No chance of freedom, no hope of release. Acknowledgement that this was seen not as a crime of passion, but as a deliberate act. As the gavel fell, there was grief, there was relief, and there was distance. Some in public said that justice had been served. Others lamented that it had taken a life to get that conviction. Still others questioned whether the system had done enough earlier. In the wake of the verdict, broader conversations rippled outward. Advocates for domestic violence victims pointed out how restraining orders are often symbolic unless police and courts enforce them. They criticized how repeated bond hearings allowed alleged offenders back into public life. They lamented how victim pleas often fall into bureaucratic limbo until something irrevocable happens. The community asked, whose responsibility is it to intervene when danger is mounting but hasn't yet exploded? How many signals must be ignored before tragedy is written? Cornisha's children and loved ones would carry the weight of her absence. They would remember the woman she was, the routine she kept, the laughter she offered, the caution she adopted in later months. They would grieve not just for her death, but for the future she might have built. Some would testify in court, others would speak quietly to media. They would insist that her death not be forgotten, that others see in her story not a closed file but a warning. For viewers like you, the case of Cornisha Butler carries lessons. It asks, do we see the red flags when someone is threatened repeatedly? Do we listen to letters, pleas, phone logs, neighbors' statements? Do we demand that protective orders become active shields, not symbolic scrolls? Do we press our systems, legal, police, social, to respond before escalation becomes fatal? If you've remained with me this far, your voice matters. Share what you think. Which moments in this case do you think mattered most? What changes would you make in systems for domestic violence victims? Could some act earlier have prevented this tragedy? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you found value in this story, consider liking, subscribing, or sharing, because stories like this deserve to be heard. Until the next case, stay watchful, stay compassionate, and never assume danger is distant when someone is whispering warnings already.